You think the internet is in the air. Satellites, signal towers, a cloud with a name that suggests weather. That is the picture almost everybody carries, and it is not a stupid picture. Every part of using the internet feels wireless, right up to the wall. Here is the problem. About 95% of international data traffic never goes near the sky. It runs along cables lying on the seabed, many of them about as thick as a garden hose. And that fact is not the interesting one. It is the setup for a much stranger one. Those cables break. On average, somewhere between 150 and 200 times a year, roughly every other day, somewhere in the world, one of them fails. That is normal. That is expected. The system is designed for it, and almost none of it reaches you. What is not designed for it is the thing that goes out and fixes them. There is a fleet of ships that does this work. It is privately owned, it averages about 20 years old, and roughly 2/3 of it reaches the end of its working life within 15 years. This file is not about who might cut a cable. It is about who is going to mend one in 2040. This is the RISE Index, where we follow the routes the goods, energy, and power actually travel, and ask what happens at the narrow parts. Last file ended in the Malacca Strait on a promise that the next choke point would have no water in it, no owner in any ordinary sense, and nowhere you could go and stand. That was slightly misleading, and deliberately so. This one does have a location. It is just that the location moves, and there are not very many of them. 3 numbers frame the whole file. 1. More than 700,000 miles of telecommunications cable lie on the seabed right now. 2. Industry forecasts put the total length growing by roughly another 48% by 2040. That is a projection, not a measurement, and it is worth holding lightly. But the direction is not in dispute. 3. And this is the one the other 2 exist to make strange. The number of specialized ships capable of repairing that cable is not growing to match. It is shrinking by attrition as the existing ones get old. Everything after this is the arithmetic of those 3 numbers pulling in different directions. And the reason nobody has closed the gap is not money exactly. It is that 4 different parties each have a completely reasonable argument for why it should be somebody else's $100 million. Start with the story you have probably already heard, because it is everywhere and because it is not wrong. The story is that submarine cables are a security problem, that they are unguarded, that they run through contested water, and that a state which wanted to hurt another state could reach one. There is real material behind that. In June of 2026, the American regulator voted to require licenses for operators of the terminal equipment at cable landing points, and to bar equipment from China and from countries designated as foreign adversaries. Back in 2009, American officials moved to block a proposed cable between Los Angeles and Hong Kong. And there are incidents. Vessels have been accused of damaging cables near Taiwan. There have been investigations into damage in the Baltic Sea. Be careful with those. They are allegations and open investigations, not findings, and this file is not going to treat them as more settled than they are. But here is what the security story leaves out, and it leaves it out consistently. Most cable faults are not attacks, they are accidents. A ship drops anchor in the wrong place. A trawler drags a net across the seabed. There is an undersea landslide, or an earthquake, or simple abrasion where a cable crosses rock. The overwhelming majority of the 150 to 200 annual faults are ordinary industrial mishaps, and they have been happening at roughly that rate for a long time. Which means the security framing gets the threat model backwards. It asks how we stop somebody cutting a cable when the cables are already being cut constantly by nobody in particular. And that reframes the question entirely. If breakage is routine and unavoidable, then the thing that determines whether a network is robust is not how well it is guarded. It is how fast it gets fixed. And what decides how fast it gets fixed turns out, more often than you would want, to have nothing to do with the sea at all. So what does fixing one actually involve? A cable fault is not a repair you drive to. The break is usually somewhere between a few hundred and a few thousand meters down. And the first job is finding it, which is done electrically, from shore, by measuring where the signal stops behaving. Then, a ship has to go there. Not a ship, a cable ship. A specialized vessel with cable tanks, handling gear, and a crew trained to do a job almost nobody else does. It locates the cable on the seabed, hooks it, cuts out the damaged section, splices in new cable, tests it, and lays the repaired section back down. On a good day in decent weather, a single repair runs somewhere between $1 and $3 million. And it is worth being concrete about who does it, because the abstraction hides them. A cable ship carries a jointer. That is a specific trade, and there are not many people in the world who hold it. The job is to take two ends of a fiber optic cable on a moving deck and fuse them so precisely that light passes through the join and barely notices. The splice itself takes hours. Getting the ship to the right patch of ocean, in weather that permits working over the side, takes considerably longer. And the person doing it trained for years to perform a procedure that, when it goes well, nobody anywhere will ever know happened. And how long it takes is a question this file is going to refuse to answer with a number, because the honest answer is a range. Weeks to months, depending on where the fault is, what the weather does, and how far the nearest ship was. And on one more thing that matters more than it sounds: how long the paperwork takes. We will come back to the paperwork because it is the part that turns an engineering problem into a political one. Now hold that picture and count the ships. This is a small fleet. Not small like an industry with a few hundred players. Small like a number you could write on one line. The average vessel in it is around 20 years old. Roughly 2/3 of the fleet reaches the end of its working life within about 15 years. Analysis of what it would take to simply keep service at today's level puts the figure at around $3 billion. 15 replacement ships and 5 additional ones. 13 of those replacements are needed between 2026 and 2025. A new cable ship costs on the order of $100 million. Read those together and the shape appears. The cable network is forecast to grow by nearly half. The fleet that repairs it is scheduled, by age alone, to shrink by 2/3, and the money to close that gap is not committed anywhere. Which raises a question with an answer that sounds absurd at first and stops sounding absurd about 2 minutes later. Why would anybody build one of these ships on purpose? So why does nobody build the ships? Not because it is a secret. Everyone in the industry knows the numbers and has known for years. The trade press has been writing about it since well before this file. The reason is that a cable repair ship is a terrible business, and it is terrible in a specific and instructive way. It costs $100 million. Its entire economic purpose is to sit still and be available, and you make money from it only when something goes wrong. Maintenance is bought through agreements where a group of cable owners collectively pay a retainer for a ship to be on standby in their region. The ship earns its keep by existing near a problem that has not happened yet, which is a sensible arrangement, and it works right up until somebody has to write the check for the next $100 million hull. Because at that moment, everybody's incentive is the same, and it is to wait. The cable owner would prefer somebody else fund the vessel. The ship operator would prefer a longer contract before committing capital. And the ministry that would be extremely upset if a repair took 4 months has, in most countries, no budget line for boats at all. Nobody is behaving irrationally. Every one of those positions is correct from where it is standing. And that is worth sitting with, because it is the shape this season keeps finding. There is no villain in the room. There is a bill that 4 parties can each reasonably decline to be the first to pay. There is also a timing problem underneath it. A cable ship takes years to design and build. So, the decision to have a vessel available in 2035 is a decision somebody has to make now, on behalf of a fault that has not happened yet in an ocean nobody can name in advance. Capital markets are not good at that. They are good at pricing assets that produce revenue. A standby vessel produces availability, and availability only becomes visible in the moment it is missing. Last file, the response to an immovable choke point was what we called a portfolio, not a route. Pipelines, stockpiles, port projects, a set of partial hedges that bought time without solving anything. The difference here is that there is no portfolio. There is no partial hedge for a repair ship. Either a vessel with cable tanks is within reach of the fault, or the fault sits there. So let us name what is being described, because the season is going to need it again. The repair gap. The distance between how fast a system is being built and how fast the ability to fix it is being replaced. It has 3 properties that make it dangerous. It widens slowly. It appears on no balance sheet because the absence of a ship is not an expense, and it is invisible until precisely the moment it is not. And there is a 4th thing about it, stranger than the other 3. The gap does not fall on everybody equally. It has a very clear preference about where it lands, and it is not the countries you would expect. Now the paperwork as promised. When a cable breaks inside a country's territorial waters, a repair usually requires a permit, which is reasonable. It is a foreign vessel doing industrial work in sovereign water. The difficulty is that the permit process was not designed around the urgency of the thing it governs. In some jurisdictions, it takes days. In others, it can take many weeks, during which the ship is available, the crew is paid, the fault is located, and nothing happens. And out beyond territorial waters, the opposite problem appears. A cable in international waters sits in a legal space where the question of whose rules apply and who is obliged to do anything at all is genuinely unsettled. So the same physical job, same ship, same splice, same 3 days of actual work can take 2 weeks or 2 months, depending entirely on which side of a line on a chart the break happened to occur. Which is where this file connects back to the first one. Suez showed a choke point that lost 40% of its traffic without ever closing. Nothing was blocked. The canal worked perfectly. The traffic simply went elsewhere, and the losses were real anyway. A cable network degrades the same way. There is rarely a moment where a country goes dark. What happens is slower and much harder to photograph. Capacity drops. Traffic reroutes onto longer paths, latency rises, prices on wholesale routes move, businesses that depend on low latency get quietly worse, trading, cloud services, video. And every one of those effects is fully reversible the moment the cable is fixed, which is exactly why the repair time is the whole variable and why nobody puts it on a poster. So who actually carries this? Not, in the first instance, the people who own the cables. The large network operators run multiple routes, and when one fails, traffic moves to another. That is what redundancy is for, and it works. The exposure sits with the places that do not have another route. Consider a mid-sized island economy served by 2 cables, not a hypothetical arrangement, a very common one. 1 cable is normal maintenance. 2 cables is redundancy. But if the second one fails while the first is still being repaired, the arithmetic changes shape completely. Now consider what the local operator is doing while waiting, not engineering. Waiting. The fault is found, the ship exists, the splice is a known procedure, the variable is a permit, a queue, and a weather window. And think about what that waiting looks like from inside. An operator on a small island, watching a network run at a fraction of capacity, fielding calls from banks and hospitals and schools, with nothing to offer any of them except a date that keeps moving. They have no engineering problem to solve. That is the strange cruelty of it. The fault is located, the ship exists, the procedure is routine. What they are waiting on is a signature. Nothing about the technology changed. Nothing about the crew's competence changed. The thing that determines whether the outage lasts 2 weeks or 2 months is a set of administrative decisions made by people who will never see the ship. That is the repair gap collected from a specific place, and it is collected hardest from the economies with the least redundancy, which are almost always the smallest ones. So, what is the actual choke point here? 3 figures answer it. 1. About 95% of international data crosses the seabed on infrastructure owned and maintained almost entirely by private companies. 2. That infrastructure fails between 150 and 200 times a year, mostly by accident, and that rate is not going down. 3. The fleet that repairs it averages 20 years old, 2/3 of it retires within 15 years, and closing that gap costs about $3 billion that nobody has agreed to spend. The choke point is not a strait, and it is not a cable. It is a number of ships, and the number is small. And notice what kind of problem that is. It is not a technical problem. The splice is well understood. It is not a geographic problem. The ocean is not getting bigger. It is a problem of who pays for standing capacity that generates nothing until the day it generates everything. Every choke point in this season so far has been something you could photograph. A canal, a strait. This one is a spreadsheet nobody owns. The internet is not going to fail. That is not the finding, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. What will happen is duller and more expensive. Repairs get slower. Some places wait longer than others. And the cost lands on whoever had the fewest cables to begin with. 3 files in, and the season's shape is showing. Suez was a choke point you could see and photograph. Malacca was one you could not move. This one is a choke point made of maintenance schedules and standby contracts. All 3, in the end, are physical: a canal, a strait, a hull. But what happens when the narrow part is not a place or an object at all, and cannot be widened by building anything? Next file. A material that is not scarce, mined in a dozen countries, sitting in the ground on every continent. And one country processes about 90% of it. Having the rock, it turns out, is not the same as controlling the supply, and the difference is a chemistry problem nobody wanted to own. This is the Rise Index. Subscribe and follow where power moves next.